Yes, I'm going to read something that's not in your impossible voice, something that is not in print or available as a downloadable e-file, available nowhere. So the setup is there's 3 older Chinese gentlemen in Reno. They live in the Bay Area. They're originally from Taiwan. They've been living in the Bay Area a long time, but they're on vacation in Reno with their wives, and the 3 of them decided to take an excursion to Virginia City. Arrival onto C Street, the main drag, and what seemed coming over Geiger's Summit out of Red Desert to be the only street in town. It wasn't because of the carny billboards on the winding mountain road beckoning you to tourist traps with names like Bucket of Blood. That kind of come-on was expected. Unable at first to secure the distinctly odd impression the city made after cruising past a few blocks of weathered 2- and 3-story facades, he attributed it to a matter of proportion. The once glittering Paris of the West, clinging to rock cliffs, had preserved its original layout. It hadn't been redone for cars, surrounded by effectively nothing, particularly to the east, which stretched, for all purposes, to infinity. The brick and clapboard structures and hilly streets meant for humans and horses were nonetheless packed tightly together, its lines neither clean nor geometric. Still, it was built. This wasn't something you came across anymore. Most old towns were restorations. He imagined remote villages in China as something like this, different construction materials, but same handmade feel. It was several degrees colder in the range than in the valley. Terry, Jonathan, and PK, their wives had abstained, wore down jackets and could see their breath. The covered plank sidewalks were coated by ice. PK slipped. He got up on his own power and continued limping along. They came upon the former offices of the Territorial Enterprise. It was closed, but Terry read the plaques out front. Mark Twain, who greatly enriched the literature of the West, started his career as a writer in this building in 1862 on the editorial staff of the Territorial Enterprise. He'd always thought of Twain as a Southerner. This in no way qualified as South. If anything, it was the classic setting for Western. But Twain had somehow made it out to this rock desert. It must not have been easy to get around the country in those days. San Francisco had not even occurred to Terry. Jack London, anyway, was the writer he most associated with the Bay. In Oakland was a replica of London's shack. In Chengdu was Dufu's thatched hut. The message of both was same. Good writing comes from bad fate. Dufu had written that. The police had come for him once because of Huckleberry Finn. That was university days. There was a lot of sensitivity then, understandably so, what with the Cultural Revolution, incomprehensibly frightening talk from the mainland, blasphemy against Confucian civilization. There wasn't there, a very real sense they were the last bulwark against barbarism. The official line in Taiwan was 5,000 years of Chinese civilization were being ground to dust. The policeman had come to his dormitory, someone had tipped him off, but he could never think who, misread the author attribution of his Chinese translation of Twain's novel. Mark had been transliterated into the Chinese characters Ma Ke, the same ideogram pair forming the beginning of Ma Ke Si for Marx, Ma for horse. Once he cleared that up, the policemen, already uneasy in the cloistered campus atmosphere, were abashed and politely apologized to the young scholar, who knew what they would have done to him today. But he couldn't remember ever getting through Huck Finn in Chinese. That incident was the only reason he remembered he ever had a copy of it. If he had, the words must have passed straight through him. He did, years later, read Tom Sawyer in English, Huck Finn in the original after that, but the rendition of the dialogue was too much and he gave up without getting very far. He never believed those of his friends and schoolmates who'd claimed to have read it all the way through, never mind something like Faulkner, But they were all too happy to jump in at moment's notice and hold forth on the importance of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn or Faulkner, whether to themselves or world literature speaking on his behalf. But it occurred to him you couldn't really get what was going on in those books if you weren't a real American, that is, like his children who did not read books. All other opinions were suspicious. It didn't matter because the conversations were never about the contents of the books themselves as what they stood for, the greatness and democracy of American literature, like the land itself. Great, perhaps, but also he secretly suspected the works to be more esoteric and exclusive than anything to be found in the classical Chinese canon. They walked along C Street on a mild downhill grade. Once it seemed the main part of town was thinning, they hung a U-turn and went back up the slope on the other side of the street. This was the eastern side, still in shadow. This circuit, no more than a few blocks, took longer than it seemed. The ice had not yet melted. The cold was bitter and hard to take. For relief, they dropped into whatever shops huddled under the awning that caught their eye. Jonathan developed an interest in Indian concho belts. By the time they were making the return trip, the sun was nearing its peak. They ducked into a bookstore, probably their last stop in town. A life-size dummy of Twain greeted them as they entered, dressed in that white suit and string tie, legs crossed, looking a bit put out by the player piano squeezing him into a corner. The main display was books of regional interest, but they were more drawn to the back of the room, a kind of museum. An antique gold balance scale sat on a shelf, delivered, read the placard, from London to San Francisco, then brought over the Sierras to join 140 years later on that shelf what was claimed to be the first light bulbs and phonograph in the city. What most interested the three engineers, though, were the sectional cutaway maps of Sutro Tunnel, the 6-mile-long drainage tunnel running through the mines terminating below the streets of the city. There was a Chinese restaurant next to the bookstore, the only one in town, probably. It didn't look like the kind of place you'd go into, just another tourist trap. The plaque by its entrance said the cross alley heading east, sharply down the hill, led into what had once been Chinatown. It didn't look like they could fit 1/3 of the city's population, what the plaque claimed, into that dirt lot. But there must have been a flourishing neighborhood here once. He imagined San Francisco's Chinatown, which likewise clung to the side of a steep slope, ducks hanging in windows, cluttered general goods stores, Taoist shrines, cabins filled with the sounds and clatter of Cantonese opera and mahjong. The restaurant, then, was like this whole city, as much an attraction as a way to commemorate the existence of these people. But there was no sign of them now, not even inside the restaurant. It occurred to him the only Chinese in town in that moment might be themselves. But somebody or something had been there as recently as the night before. At his feet in snow, shreds of red paper. No other signs of the new year. Yes, that's what it was. He'd forgotten. There was so little in this part of the world to remind you. A Saturday. It wasn't the fake Chinese New Year they celebrated a week later in the casinos, when the Cantonese singers sang live and all the buffets served what was supposed to be Chinese food. It wasn't the one they celebrated 2 weeks later in San Francisco with that parade, which actually should have been, properly speaking, the Lantern Festival, or Yuan Xiaojie, marking the year's first lunar half-cycle and therefore the end of New Year's festivities. But in China today, the entire population would be on the move, trying to get back to wherever they called home. It was very important. Here, nobody ever even knew when Chinese New Year was, even though they all talked about it. It was, hey, when's Chinese New Year? Chinese New Year, didn't that already happen? Now he realized even he wasn't very clear on this anymore. The one clue which he should have noticed that it was in fact Chinese New Year was in the casino. There weren't a lot of Chinese people. This was abnormal. On a regular weekend, you'd be elbowing through them, or more likely getting elbowed. Everyone knows the Chinese love to gamble. But the real Chinese New Year was the one time of year they went someplace else. Nobody knew this. Chinese New Year was not the time to go out and party and go to a Chinese restaurant. It was time spent at home with elders and children, peered inward. The quietude would only be broken at intervals by the explosion of firecrackers. But it had been a long time since he'd spent Chinese New Year with his children, not to mention his parents, and apparently the others had forgotten as well. Elian, if she knew, wouldn't bring it up. The scraps of the spent firecrackers lay there on the ice, a paltry pile compared to those that would fill the squares and alleys of San Francisco Chinatown and the streets of Taipei. Whoever had set them off had already melted into the background, gone underground.